term superstock has been used in a variety of racing series, usually in reference to some kind of modified road car. From the manufacturer's standpoint in the early 1960s, it was really pretty much the same thing. Early superstocks were a series of cars that could be purchased from the factory and taken directly to the drag strip. Some were homologation specials, and some were just factory hot rods. Most were street legal, while others could be made that way. Factory hot rods had been around forever, with factory-backed racing being a leading form of advertising from the very beginning. And post-war cars, such as the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 and Hudson Hornet, certainly had racing in mind, creating a horsepower war that would lead to the muscle cars of the 1960s. When Chrysler introduced the 300 in 1955, it was not aimed at drag racing, but stock car racing, as was the trend, and may not be an actual superstock, but it was certainly a precursor, getting its name from its 300 horsepower, 331 cubic inch firepower Hemi V8, moving the large car to nearly 130 miles an hour and a mid-17-second quarter mile, advertised as the world's fastest regular production car. For 1956, it became the 300B, with a bigger 5.8-liter 354 with 340 to 355 horsepower, or 1 horsepower per cubic inch, and it was more than a second quicker. The 300C of 1957 raised the ante with 392 cubic inches and 375 to 390 horsepower, with optional fuel injection, a 15-second car with a top speed near 130. In the 1959 300E, the Hemi was replaced by a 413 wedge. Although bigger, horsepower was rated at 380, but torque was up 15, and the engine weighed less. The 300F switched to unitized construction for 1960 and introduced its trademark crosshair grille. Horsepower was now 375 to 400 as the car peaked in performance, edging it into the high 14-second range. For the 1961 300G, there was a slight decrease in performance, but a manual became available, and it gained bigger wheels and brakes for the shorter, lightened, and definned 1962 300H. Up to 405 horsepower, the top version was back under 15 seconds in the quarter mile, although there were now lesser versions of the car as the non-letter series 300. When the restyled 300J arrived for 1963, it had 390 horsepower, and performance was down some, and the focus was moving more towards luxury, with added features and softer suspension, although the 300K reduced features in an effort to lower the prices to just over $4,000. For 1965, the 300L was bigger and heavier, and horsepower was down to 360, but now a 4-speed was available. It was still a low 15-second car with a top speed around 130 miles an hour, but it was the last year of the letter series 300s, unless you count the 300 Hearst of 1970, which was more of an appearance package, but it still had 375 horsepower and a quarter mile time of just over 15 seconds from its 440. Although the 300 isn't generally considered a superstock, as it is too well equipped and too expensive, it certainly had the performance and found its way into more than a few racing successes, and it would lead to other similar performance cars of the period. One of the first being the DeSoto Adventurer, introduced in 1956, only offered in two-tone gold with white or black. It was essentially a budget 300, $800 cheaper, starting at just over $3,700. Initially offered with a high-output 341 Hemi V8, it produced 319 horsepower for a mid-17-second quarter mile. Power was up to 345 for the restyled cars of 1957, and it was capable of a quarter mile around 16 seconds. The 1958 model moved to a dual-quad 361 wedge, and horsepower was up to 360. And for 1959, it moved to a single 4-barrel 383 for only 350 horsepower, but a mid-15-second quarter mile. 1960 would be the Adventurer's last year, and it was simply the top trim package for DeSoto, with horsepower dropping again down to 330, just as the superstock market was gaining popularity. Dodge also entered the game in 1956 with the D500, another NASCAR-inspired model. It added performance suspension, brakes, and a 215 Hemi V8 with 260 to 295 horsepower, a low 16-second car capable of more than 120 miles an hour. Bigger, heavier 1957 versions moved to a Super Red Ram 325 Hemi, bumping output to 285 or 310 with fuel injection for similar performance. Like DeSoto, Dodge moved to a bigger wedge head 361 for 1958, producing 320 horsepower in the D500, and then a 383 for 1959 in 320 to 345 horsepower tunes, a mid 15-second car capable of over 125 miles an hour. Like other Mopars, the D500 switched to unibody construction in 1960, but 1961 would be the last year of the D500, replaced in 1962 by the Ramcharger, essentially a stripped-down version of the restyled standard Dodge, powered by a 415 horsepower 413 from Chrysler, a true superstock aimed at drag racing. It was capable of a quarter mile in the high 13-second range. The 1963 model moved to a bigger 426 max wedge, continuing on with the cross-ram dual 4-barrel manifold, taking horsepower up to 425 and reducing the quarter mile to the mid-13s. And the model would carry over into 1964 as its final year, but not the end of the line, as the concept would carry over to the new mid-size car of 1965 as the Coronet Charger. Lighter and powered by a new 426 Hemi, also rated at 425 horsepower, it moved into the low 13s. But the Charger would become a separate model for 1966, restyled and aimed at NASCAR. Although the Hemi was still available, it was more of a muscle car than a superstock. Dodge still wasn't done with the concept, however, moving to the compact Dart for 1968 as the A-Bomb, still Hemi-powered with a fiberglass front end. It included neither carpet, paint, nor a warranty. Only 80 were made, and some claims say it was better than a 10-second car from the factory. Not surprisingly, Plymouth's foray into the segment was pretty similar, starting with the 1956 Fury. Only offered in sandstone and gold, it was powered by a 240 horsepower, 303 cubic inch polyhead V8, a high 16-second car with a top speed near 120. Both the car and the engine were bigger for 57, up to 318 cubic inches and 290 horsepower, for a low 16-second car able to exceed 125. And 1958 added an optional Golden Commando 5.7-liter 350 with 305 to 315 horsepower, moving the car into the 15s. But the sporty Plymouth for 1959 was the Sport Fury, as the Fury name was spread across the brand. While the 318 Super Pack remained the base engine for the Sport Fury at 260 horsepower, there was an optional Golden Commando 361 with 305 horsepower. Like its counterparts, it moved to unitized construction in a 383 for 1960. With 330 horsepower, it was a low 15-second car, but the Sport Fury was more of a nicely equipped performance car than a race car. Then the restyle of 1962 brought in the 410 to 420 horsepower 413, not only in the Sport Fury, but in a stripped race-ready Savoy, creatively called the Plymouth Superstock, making for a mid-13-second car capable of more than 120 miles an hour. But at this point, the Sport Fury came standard with a 230 horsepower 318. The Superstock engine increased in size for 1963 to 426 cubic inches with 425 horsepower, and it carried through 1964 with little change. But the Plymouth line would be restructured for 1965 with a new, bigger Sport Fury, still with a full range of V8s, from the base 230 horsepower 318 to a 365 horsepower version of the 426 wedge. And it was still a high 14-second car, capable of more than 130 miles an hour, while the Superstock stayed on the smaller B body as a version of the Belvedere, and the 425 horsepower 426 wedge kept it in the mid-13-second range. But with the introduction of the GTX Gentleman's Muscle Car, it was no longer needed. The Sport Fury, however, would carry on, as more of an image car, but performance was still an option, moving up to a 440 for 1966, still with 365 horsepower, and still in the high 14s. It gained a fast-top, semi-fastback look for 1967, and 10 more horsepower, making it slightly quicker. And for 1968, Plymouth had its own version of the race-ready A-bomb as the A-bodied Barracuda, just in primer with a fiberglass front end and factory slicks, with either a 440 wedge or a 426 Hemi. Not street legal, but listed as an 11-second car or better. The Sport Fury was restyled and even bigger for 1969 with new fuselage styling. The top version was an automatic-only 375 horsepower 440, still able to do the quarter mile in under 15 seconds. And for 1970, a Sport Fury GT was added, using a 446 pack with 390 horsepower, shaving off a couple of tenths and putting the top speed near 140. It would carry over to 1971, when the Sport Fury name was spread across to other body styles, only to be killed off in 1972. But the 440 would continue to be available in big Mopars for another half a dozen years. Like Chrysler, GM introduced fuel-injected models for 1957, but none were more successful than Chevrolet's. And in the Bel Air, a fuel-injected 283 produced 250 to 283 horsepower, a mid-15-second car capable of around 125 miles an hour. Unlike its competitors, it carried over into 1958, at least in 250 horsepower form. But the big news that year was the bigger 348, with up to 315 horsepower, for the new Impala, soon climbing to 335 horsepower, and putting the quarter mile at just over 15 seconds. Then 1961 introduced the 409 Super Sport, with 360 horsepower. It was a mid-15-second car with a top speed near 130, which in 1962 became available in a 409 horsepower version, putting it in the mid-14-second range. But it was the Z11 of 1963 that was the true superstock, with extensive use of aluminum and the engine enlarged to 427 cubic inches for more than 430 horsepower. It was a one-year-only option with less than 50 being made. But in 1964, the 409 got dual four-barrels for 425 horsepower. With the restyle of 1965, the 409 was down to 340 to 400 horsepower, but there was a 425 horsepower version of the 396. And for 1966, the 409 was replaced by a 427 with 390 to 425 horsepower, gaining Super Sport 427 badges the following year, when the focus moved to smaller muscle cars and output was down to 385 horsepower. The 1969 model got upgraded brakes and suspension, but it would be the last year of the Super Sport Impala, at least until the mid-90s, although the 427 would be replaced by an even bigger 454 with 345 to 395 horsepower. And although power would drop, the 454 would remain an option through 1976. Pontiac also introduced a fuel-injected performance model in 1957 as the Bonneville. The 347 cubic inch Strato Streak V8 produced 315 horsepower for a high 16-second quarter mile and a top speed of 125. Although the tri-power version of the same engine in the Catalina had similar output and was actually quicker. And with the restyle for 1958, the engine was up to 370 cubic inches in both the Bonneville and Catalina, with 255 to 300 horsepower. Although both would be basic trim packages for 1959, Pontiac was up to a 315 horsepower tri-power 389, providing a sub-16-second quarter mile, which was available in 348 horsepower tunes starting in 1960, as the Tempest, which would become the compact model the next year, when the big cars were updated. Mid-year would see the introduction of the first of the Big Journal Pontiac V8s as the new 421. Initially offered in the Catalina, the so-called non-streetable 421 Super Duty was rated at 405 horsepower, and there was a new, lighter Grand Prix model that was for the street, using the 348 horsepower 389 tri-power, making it a mid-14-second car capable of around 145 miles an hour. Soon to get a 370 horsepower version of the tri-power 421 of its own, putting it in the low 14s, while the race-ready Catalina was up to 410 horsepower. But with the introduction of the GTO in 1964, the big Pontiac race cars were coming to an end, sort of. The Catalina 2+2 of 1964 used the same Tri-Power 421 available in the Grand Prix, with similar performance. The big Pontiacs were restyled for 1965, and both the Grand Prix and the Catalina 2+2 carried over, although it lost its Catalina badge. The engine increased in size in 1967 to 428 cubic inches, but the Tri-Power was gone, and horsepower was only up 5, meaning top versions still ran in the high 14s. But it was the last year of the 2+2, at least in the US, as the model moved to Canada that year as the Parisian 2+2, and it could be ordered with any Chevy V8 available. A 390 horsepower version of the big Pontiac engine was available for 1968 in most of the big car models, but the Grand Prix would be downsized to the mid-size platform the next year, all but creating its own segment. The engine increased in size again for 1970 to 455 cubic inches, and in the big cars was rated at 360 to 370 horsepower, making the Catalina high output a 15-second car. But with the restyle of 1971, power was down to 335 and would continue to drop, although the 455 would remain in the big Pontiacs through 1976. Budget brands offering performance models was a relatively new concept in the mid-50s, but Ford was quick enough to embrace it, dropping the bigger 312 V8 from the Thunderbird into the standard line. It produced 215 horsepower with a manual and 225 with an automatic, making for a 17-second quarter mile and a top speed around 110. Power was up for 1957, offered in 245 to 270 horsepower tunes, easily knocking a second off the quarter mile. For 1958, there was a bigger 352 V8 with up to 300 horsepower, moving the car into the high 15s. But the real high-performance version came in 1960, when a very small few were sold tuned to 360 horsepower. It was, however, a one-year-only option, as Ford moved up to a bigger 390 as the performance engine for 1961, offered with 375 to 401 horsepower, making for a quarter mile around 14 seconds and a top speed over 135. There was a bigger engine again for 1962, up to 406 cubic inches, and power was 385 to 405, still a low 14-second car. Then 1963 introduced the FE427, raising the ratings to 410 to 425 in cars that could easily reach 140 miles an hour. But if it was a true super stock you wanted, Ford offered the Thunderbolt for 1964, which dropped a similarly rated 427 into a lightened and race-ready version of the smaller mid-size Fairlane, creating a one-year-only car that could clear the 13-second mark. The 427 would carry on, however, in the restyled big Fords of 1965, which, if anything, got quicker, and it even returned to the Fairlane in 1966, as Ford kind of straddled the realm between muscle car and superstock. Mid-1966 also introduced the 428, only rated at 345 horsepower in the big cars, but still capable of putting them in the sub-15-second range. And the 425 horsepower 427 continued in both their large and mid-size cars through 1967. The full-size line was redone in 1969, and the top engine became a 429 with 320 to 360 horsepower, taking just over 15 seconds to do the quarter mile and able to exceed 125 miles an hour. When the U.S. moved to net ratings in 1972, Ford seemed to take a bigger hit than most, with the 429 being rated at 208 horsepower. But even with the increase in weight, it still ran in the mid-17s. 1973 would be the final year of the 429, being replaced by a bigger 460 with similar power and performance. Mercury was traditionally a bigger engined version of the Fords, so the Thunderbird V8s were standard fare in 1955 and 56, and for 1957 used an even bigger 368, providing 290 horsepower in standard tune. But in the NASCAR-inspired M335, the dual four-barrels bumped output to 335 horsepower, pushing the big Merc through the quarter mile in around 15.5 seconds, and a top speed over 125. For 1958, the sportier Mercuries took on the Monterey Marauder name, up to a 383 V8 with 253 to 330 horsepower. Or in the Super Marauder, Lincoln's Monster 430, producing 400 horsepower, and in spite of the increase in size and weight, was still a mid-15-second car. Although the 430 would carry over to the next year, it was down to a 310 horsepower tune, and it would be gone for 1960. But they introduced the 390 and the Meteor Marauder Special with 330 horsepower, again a mid-15-second car. The Meteor would become the new mid-size car for 1962, but Mercury offered a line of performance specials across the board. The compact S-22 Comet, the mid-sized S-33 Meteor, and the large S-55 Monterey. The Monterey Special was essentially the Mercury version of Ford's extra lively Galaxy 500, powered by either a 390 with 300 to 330 horsepower or the 406 with 385 to 405 horsepower, making it a mid-14-second car. Called the S-55 Marauder for 1963, the 406 was replaced by a 427 with up to 425 horsepower, making it even quicker. And it was just called the Monterey Marauder again for 1964. That would carry over into the restyle of 1965. But Mercury was having trouble making up their mind, and it was once again the S-55 package for 1966, moving to a 428, marketed as a 7-liter, and producing only 345 horsepower, still a low 15-second car. The S-55 was reduced from a model to an add-on package for 1967, and then dropped for 1968. But the Marauder returned with the restyled big cars of 1969. It was marketed more as a personal coupe than a performance car, even with the X100 appearance package. But it came with either a 390 with 266 to 280 horsepower, or a 429 with 320 to 360 horsepower, only with an automatic, still managing to get into the low 15s and exceed 125 miles an hour. But it would only last through 1970. Although like at Ford, the 429 would carry into 1972, although with less power, to be replaced by a bigger 460 that was aimed more towards towing than performance, itself lasting through the 78 Marquis. Factory drag cars would continue to appear from time to time, and it was hardly the end of the concept of the large performance cars, coming back around in the 90s and continuing into the new millennium, and perhaps even into the expanding electric car era. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.